we know that. I'm gonna use this. Okay. We'll give it about 30 seconds to allow attendees to join us.
Hello, everyone. Sorry.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this afternoon program. I am Dr. Ijeoma Nwaogu, the Associate Director for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion MultiCultural Center here at Rice. I'm currently here in the MultiCultural Center. So for this program, we will be exploring COVID-19 and the election. We'll explore voter preferences and intentions. So this topic is certainly at the forefront of the thoughts of many of us, with the elections literally right around the corner, right? So that's what we're going to focus on this hour. The format of this gathering today is to hear from Dr. Stein, Dr. Vann, and student presenters, and throughout this program, you are invited to submit your questions in the Q&A section throughout this engagement. So if possible, you can try to direct your questions to our speakers. And I'm sorry, you could try to submit direct questions to our speakers. And we ask this because it can become a challenge to find your question if it's padded with comments that you may feel inclined to include. And we welcome those comments, but you're welcome to submit them using the chat feature, the chat function, and then your questions in the Q&A section. Now I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Stein and Dr. Vann. Dr. Stein is a professor of political science here at Rice, and Dr. Elizabeth Vann is the director for programs and partnerships in the Center for Civic Leadership at Rice. With that, I'd like to welcome you, Dr. Stein and Dr. Vann. They will explain the topic, and then we'll go into an introduction of our student presenters. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Sure.
So I'm Libby Vann, and I want to just tell you a little bit about the context of this work. So the research that the student team will present today comes out of an ongoing collaboration between Rice University and the Harris County Clerk's Office. In 2019, the Arnold Foundation provided a grant to the Center for Civic Leadership and the Department of Political Science to assist the Harris County Clerk's efforts to implement a county-wide voting program, which allows voters to cast ballots at any polling location on Election Day. More than 100 Rice undergraduates conducted surveys of voters at the polls in 2019, and a Houston Action research team of 4 students analyzed that data to help the county measure the effectiveness of their new program. In the spring of 2020, the county's attention necessarily shifted to how to run an election during a pandemic. An interdisciplinary team of Rice researchers received funding from Rice University's COVID-19 initiative, as well as a Bridge COVID Rapid Response Grant to support research that could assist the Harris County Clerk's Office in making voting safe and accessible for voters and poll workers during the pandemic. The students you'll hear from today are part of that research team. Now, my colleague Bob Stein will give you an overview of the research project before we hear from the students.
Very simply, this is a project that began in March and April, right after the COVID-19 epidemic gripped not only the nation, but here in Harris County. The issue here was whether or not voters would feel comfortable voting in person on or before Election Day. This is now the 3rd wave of interviewing with voters. Separate interviewing was done with poll workers to simply ask them about where and when and how they might want to vote, what kind of security and safety features they would like to have, and whether they knew about all the options available. What the 3 students, are going to discuss today is the July survey of voters after they voted in the primary runoff election. Right now, literally, the students are preparing yet another memo for the clerk on surveys that were completed just in the last month. I will now hand it over to the students to present their findings.
So hi, I'm Carolyn, and we wanted to start off talking a little bit about why this research is important before we get into our results. So if you've been paying attention to the news over the past couple months, you probably saw some articles talking about primary elections in other states and counties. And the big theme there was that there were a significant number of issues. So we had a lot of trouble with poll workers not showing up to work. There were polling place closures, and there were very long lines, which were particularly dangerous because there was not a lot of measures put in place to encourage distancing. As you can see here in this photo, this is a very long line where people are not spaced apart and not everyone's wearing masks. And what this represented was a big threat to voter safety and to how comfortable people felt voting in elections. And so really what our research is doing is trying to make sure that Harris County's elections are as safe and accessible as possible this November.
So we'll now go over some of the main takeaways from our research. We first found that the new Harris County Safe Initiative, which we'll discuss more in depth soon, was popular among making voters feel safe in voting in this upcoming election. We also found that voters plan to switch to safer voting methods this fall due to the pandemic, and that lastly, many mail-in voters are confused by the process. Overall, these takeaways suggest that the November election will be like no other that we've seen before because of the pandemic. And to be able to make voters feel safe about voting, they will need a lot of information to know how to do so.
Hello all, my name is Mason. I'm a junior at Hanson, and Arisa is a senior at Weiss. Carolyn is a senior at McMurtry, and all of them are amazing. So to go into the results of our survey, we wanted to first talk about the process we took to get to those results. So we partnered originally with the Harris County Clerk's Office and with Rice University, as Dr. Vann discussed earlier, to learn about what their intentions are, what their goals were, and what their new initiatives were for the upcoming election and how we could best support them in that effort. We then designed a survey to both learn information, preferences, and intentions from voters, and also to educate them on some of the new information the clerk was putting out, some of the new initiatives they've been taking that you may or may not have heard of. And then we also additionally wanted to understand right after the July election what their perception of that election was, and then again later in the year what their intentions were for November. We surveyed 165,000 people in Harris County who are all registered voters and received 6,578 responses from that survey. We then took the data, weighted our survey to appropriately represent the county on a number of demographics, visualized our results, which you will see later in this presentation, and then modeled the relationships between different types of intentions and those demographics using the R software and also the Qualtrics survey software. We went into this process with the goal of making the impact on increasing election safety, accessibility for all voters, and additionally helping the county clerk secure more funding from the county commissioner's court in order to make sure they could appropriately run a safe election. In addition, we wanted to understand how some of the initiatives they've taken this year and will continue to take in the lead up to the election could be replicated in future years to improve elections for all years, not just in this special year.
And so now we're going to start to tell you a little bit more in depth about what our results looked like. And the first set of questions we asked voters were about what their July voting experience was like. So we were very fortunate that about 33% of our survey sample voted in July, which is much higher than the overall population rate, which was under 10%. And so the main thing we focused on asking these voters about was the SAFE initiative, and that's something new the county has started since COVID-19 to ensure that voters can remain safe. And as you can see here, essentially what that looks like is a lot of different precautions. So physical distancing measures, they spread apart all the voting machines, they changed floor plans to maximize distancing. They also are providing lots of PPE to both poll workers and voters. And essentially they're doing everything that they are legally permitted to make sure that people cannot contract COVID-19 while they vote. And what we found when we asked voters about the SAFE initiative and other aspects of their July voting experience is that overwhelmingly all voters were really happy with their voting experience in July. And here you can see 2 quotes that are kind of indicative of all of our responses. But essentially, voters did not have any issues, they didn't face lines, and they felt really confident in the election administration, and that's something that's kind of carrying them through, and they trust that the election is going to be well run in November. And that's really exciting news for Harris County, but also for all of us as voters, that this really will be a safe experience. Something else we wanted to highlight is that there were a couple of small differences among subpopulations in terms of how they rated their July voting experience. So Republicans were actually slightly more likely to rate the SAFE initiative positively. And we hypothesized that that might be because Republicans are generally a little bit less concerned about COVID. So probably that kind of marginal jump they need to get them to feel safe to vote is just a little bit smaller than with Democratic and nonpartisan voters. Then respondents who knew someone who had had COVID-19 were similarly more likely to rate the July election and safe even more positively than other voters. And we think that's just because they really are paying attention, they know what it feels like to be impacted by the pandemic, and they really appreciated that the county was taking measures to keep them safe. And then finally, our only difference we found among racial and ethnic groups was that Asian Americans are slightly more likely to rate safe negatively, but we found a very small effect size for that.
We next wanted to look at the impact of the SAFE initiatives on voters' likelihood of voting. So as you can see here on the left, there's the SAFE initiatives that Carolyn mentioned previously. And then we're showing for each SAFE initiative, what was the percentage of voters that ranked each initiative as substantially, minimally, or having no impact on their likelihood of voting. We see that the top 2 initiatives that were the most impactful were floor plans for distancing and PPE for the poll workers. On the contrary, we found that finger coverings were the least impactful. What's the most important on these findings is that all initiatives were very impactful, with the blue and the yellow making up the majority of respondents. It's also important to note that for each category, there were some people who responded that the initiative would have no impact for them. So we wanted to understand more about these people. We found that these voters primarily fell into 2 categories. The first was that they will vote regardless of what the county does or does not do. So basically these voters are very passionate about what they're doing and about voting. And so the SAFE initiative has minimal impact on their likelihood of voting. The second, as shown on the right, was that some voters have larger risks of contracting COVID-19. Therefore, the SAFE initiatives will not have a large impact on their likelihood to vote because they are scared of contracting the virus. It's important to note, though, that this second category was very, very small, and that actually most voters who responded that the SAFE initiative has no impact for them primarily fell into the first category of being very passionate and excited to vote. We also wanted to understand the impact of the SAFE initiatives by different subpopulations. So we found that the SAFE initiatives were more impactful for women and Democrats, and along racial and ethnic boundaries, we found that they were more impactful for Black, Asian American, and Latinx voters. And lastly, voters with a disability and voters who know someone with COVID-19 are more likely to rate the SAFE initiatives as impactful. This makes sense because they are more scared of getting COVID-19, and it shows that the SAFE initiatives are very impactful in making them feel safe about voting in this November's election.
Next, we wanted to understand how the threat level of COVID-19 across the county would have an impact on voters' intentions for November. So we presented voters with a variety of scenarios in which the threat level of COVID-19 was varied. So the threat level is defined by the Harris County judge on a scale of 1 to 4, and it's an approximation of how severe the COVID threat level is in Harris County at a time. So if you may remember, during June, the threat level was a 1, and perhaps during February, we would define the threat level as a 4 as really being not much of a threat. And so we understood in our survey that by presenting a variety of threat levels to different voters, they really had no impact on how voters intended to vote in November. And the overwhelming takeaway here is that nearly everyone plans to vote in some capacity, And of those people who intend to vote in person, over 80% of them intend to vote early. And then to further break down how people intend to vote in November, we compared this to how they've historically voted. And so we took a measure of how they collectively have voted in previous elections and analyzed what their most likely method would be if the COVID-19 pandemic did not exist. And so the bottom graph shows that historical preference. And we see that the majority of voters intend to vote early. Substantial, around 25% of them intended to vote by election day, and then a significantly smaller percentage would vote by mail in a typical year. And in November, there seems to be a pretty dramatic shift here. So again, still nearly 60% intend to vote early, but the proportion that intend to vote on election day is much smaller, and that seems to have shifted to vote by mail. However, this change is not quite as cut and dry as this graph makes it appear. And instead, we note that what's happened is an overall shift towards safer voting methods. So over 50% of election day voters are now intending to vote early. And then some of those early voters, 18%, are now switching to mail-in voting. So voters are taking the opportunity and recognizing that there are safer voting methods for them. And if they're eligible to vote by mail, they're taking that next step to go vote by mail. If they originally voted on election day, they recognize that voting early helps them avoid lines. They can spread out their time interacting with people, and they can really have as safe an experience as possible. And so a lot of them are switching to early voting. However, concerningly, nearly 20% of people who historically voted via mail-in voting are switching back to early voting, which we would generally consider a less safe option. However, we understand that a lot of the jargon over the summer and the news coverage has sown some distrust in people in mail-in voting, both because of understood that there may be some funding cuts for people, and mail-in voting may not be as safe, or your vote may not be appropriately counted. And so people are a little fearful of this. And we understand that leads them to switch to early voting, where they can guarantee they show up at the polling location, they cast their ballot, their vote is counted. And so we understand that many voters are making this choice to switch back to early voting from mail-in voting, but the overall story here is that people are switching to safer voting methods where appropriate. And then there are some minor differences by subpopulation, where voters who are over 65, Democrats, or those voters that have a disability are most likely to switch to vote to early or voting by mail and choosing those safer methods because they may impact them more.
So as Mason mentioned, overall, there are going to be a lot more people voting by mail this November than is typical. And so actually what we see here is that of all the intended mail-in voters, 50% of them are what we would call new mail-in voters, which means that they have never voted by mail before. And something else we thought was really important to highlight is that eligible nonpartisan Republican, Black, and Latinx voters are significantly less likely to have applied for their mail-in ballot if they're eligible. So that's something we kind of highlighted for the county, just to let them know that these are kind of the target populations that they really need to push voting by mail to. Since we did have so many new mail-in voters this year, we were really interested in learning about whether they knew how to vote by mail. And I would encourage you all to think right now, do you know how to vote by mail? So we showed all of our survey respondents these 4 options, and then we asked them the same question we're asking you. And then afterwards, we wanted to provide kind of a voter education component. So we told them what the correct options for voting by mail are. And you can see them here on the screen, highlighted in blue. The only 2 ways you can apply for and submit your mail-in ballot is by mailing it to the clerk's office or hand delivering it to the clerk's office. You cannot submit things online, and you also cannot drop off your ballot at polling locations. So if you out there are planning to vote by mail, please make sure that you vote by mail correctly. Unfortunately, and one of the reasons for emphasizing that is that we found that the vast majority of our survey respondents do not know how to correctly vote by mail. And that is true for both applying for their mail-in ballot and then actually submitting the ballot once they have it. Kind of as you can see here, a pretty overwhelming proportion of voters do not know how to do that. And we thought that was particularly concerning because these voters, as I mentioned earlier, we have like a pretty high July voting rate. These are pretty hardy voters. And so if they don't know how to vote by mail, it's likely that probably the majority of the county does not either. So that's something we told Harris County about, and they're working to do kind of a public information campaign about how to vote by mail to try and tackle that issue.
We also wanted to understand if voters were interested in drive-through voting. Drive-through voting is when a voter can vote without leaving their car and is now actually an option in Harris County. We found that 53% of voters would vote at a drive-through location, and this represents the majority, wanting to use this safer alternative. Specifically among subpopulations, we found that young, female, Democratic, nonpartisan, Asian American, Black, and Latinx voters are most likely to want to drive-through vote. And lastly, we found that voters who have a disability or know someone with COVID-19 are more likely to want this drive-through method, which keeps in line with the previous trends that we found of these voters wanting to switch to safer voting methods. With these results, we were able to recommend to the clerk's office that they implement drive-through voting. And now there will be 10 locations spread throughout Houston that will offer this service throughout the entirety of the election.
In addition, we asked voters if they'd be interested in a website from the clerk's office with live information on polling locations, what times those locations are open, and estimated wait time at each location throughout the day for both early voting and on election day. And overwhelmingly, we found that nearly 3/4 of respondents are likely to use such a website. And those respondents who are not interested in the website, the vast majority of them stated their reason is that they always vote at the same polling location. So they're not interested in this information because they don't need any information. They're going to do the same thing they've always done. And we found some small differences by subpopulation here as well, where younger voters, women, Asian American voters, Latinx, and Democratic voters are more likely to use this website. And in addition, voters who know someone who contracted COVID-19 are more likely to use the website. I think the story here continues is that people are interested in more information so they can most appropriately vote safely and vote effectively in the November elections. So they're interested in learning this information live. Okay, so moving forward into some implications of our research and the next steps is that Harris County has used our work to make voting safer and easier. They've taken in our responses, implemented public information campaigns, as Carolyn talked about, implemented drive-through voting. The website will be live for early voting and election day. And there will be a new thing that we didn't ask about at all of 24-hour voting on Thursday, October 29th, October 28th. And then these are some options of how the clerk has taken our work to help voting be safer and easier. And to confirm our results for the clerk, we also wanted to ask voters many of the same questions again, much closer to the election. So as Dr. Stein alluded to in the beginning, we paneled back over 1,800 respondents from this survey we just discussed. And we additionally asked another 4,100 new respondents, many of the same questions again on mail-in voting and their intentions in November, and also discussed some more specific things the clerk has done in the time since we designed the original survey. This finished yesterday. We have the initial results, and they're many of the same story, is that voters are intending to switch to safer voting methods where available, except for some of those who have distrust in mail-in voting and are switching back to early voting. Voters still do not know how to vote by mail, and so there's still a need to continue that public information campaign. And many of them are interested in new voting methods like drive-through voting, 24-hour voting, and they're all interested in utilizing the website. So we've taken both this future survey and the current survey to validate our previous work and provide constant additional guidance to the clerk for November so we can support them throughout the entire year in making this election as great an election as it can be.
And as we're starting to wrap up this presentation, we thought we would be remiss if we didn't take the opportunity to encourage all of you to go vote if you're eligible. So you've heard today about a lot of new options and safety precautions that Harris County is taking. Something else new this year is that you can vote at any polling location in the county. So say, for example, if you work here at Rice, but don't live in this precinct, you are able to vote at the Rice polling location, which is located at the stadium and very convenient. So we wanted to highlight that that's an option for everyone. But yes, we really encourage you to share this information with your family, your friends, and your colleagues, and make your plan to vote. Early voting actually starts in just a couple days on October 13th, and election day is November 3rd, so that'll be here before we know it too. There's also time to request a mail-in ballot still if you're eligible. You have until October 23rd, but we definitely encourage you to do that as soon as possible if you're eligible. Thank you so much for coming to our presentation. We hope you enjoyed it, and we also hope you go vote in November. Thank you.
Awesome, awesome. Caroline, Mason, Arisa, a huge accomplishment in having your research submitted to Harris County Clerk's office. I mean, that's a huge accomplishment. So kudos and thank you for that. It's very important that we have a safer way to vote and for proposing the drive-through voting. So wonderful. Dr. Stein, I'm not sure if you are there yet.
Yep, I'm looking for any questions.
Yeah.
I know Morgan just said, great job, you all. So good work. If no one has a question, I'll ask. If no other reason, I haven't seen the full report from the upcoming results. Is there any reason to think that the events of the last month, week, hour, minutes, the increasing debate and legal challenges both in the state about mail-in voting, the decision of the Supreme Court not to let the county clerk mail out ballot applications, or the cutback in drop-off locations might have or have had an effect on how voters want to vote? And I'm asking you to think maybe about what you also know from the current survey you just finished in September.
I think that there definitely has been some impact. So we looked at the change from historical preferences to the August survey, and then again to the survey we just completed on how people intend to vote. And people are still shifting their intentions. So we probably understand that they've continued to gather information in the lead up to the election and making their decision. And so perhaps in August, it might have been too early to think about how exactly they wanted to vote. And we understand that many voters are still shifting. As we said, like many of them are shifting to early voting if they previously voted on election day. And then if they're eligible, they're shifting to mail-in voting. Choosing that safer option has been a really popular choice for voters of all demographics in order to make sure they can vote as safely and effectively as possible. However, we've also seen like there's been a lot of national rhetoric against mail-in voting and some like very legitimate worries about how they may not be able to appropriately mail-in vote due to a loss in funding or like the closing of the drop boxes. And so many people are shifting to early voting to make sure their vote is counted appropriately.
If any, either Caroline or Arisa, if you want to. So here's a question from Phil Cordham, who was one of your collaborators. Will you be following up the election after the election to see how these novel new methods, drive-in voting, 24 hours, have actually been used?
Hopefully, if we get the data from the county clerk, then yeah.
Are you guys available to do that work?
We would always be available. I think that would be very interesting, though, to kind of compare what someone said their intentions were versus and what we predict will happen in November to what actually occurred. Because while these are intentions, we know that intentions sometimes may not play out.
Mason?
Same thing as Arisa said.
I'll tell you the good news. This team has been so effective and efficient. I don't know if all of you caught it, that the team was able to send out over 150,000 invitations to finish the survey. The response rates are small, running about 3.5%, sometimes as high as 4%, but those are really quite large for these types of web-based surveys. If you read the report, you'll see they are in fact quite representative of the electorate, slightly over-representative of Republicans in a blue county. But here's the good news. We have ample resources to do a post-election survey. So if Phil is listening, the COVID-19 grant, which the university gave us, is going to easily extend over. And I should say that the company that provides us our sample, L2, has been very generous in giving us a much lower rate. So don't graduate this year, and we'll have plenty of time next year to do more of this work. I'm looking for any other questions. Libby is, I don't know if Libby's still on. Libby Vann, who also knows this, she may want to pepper you with some questions. If not, I have plenty. Do you get a
Go for it.
Do you guys get a sense from the survey data that voters may in fact not be deterred by COVID-19, but more resolute in finding ways to vote safely?
I would say, I think the main thing we've seen is, like Mason mentioned, the specific threat of COVID-19, like how extreme it is, doesn't seem to be playing a huge role. But I do think we're seeing a clear finding that like COVID-19 as a whole, just as a force in the world, is really encouraging people to change their voting methods. And I do think that is an indication that people are kind of being resilient and in a response to the pandemic, and they are really trying to work with it. We have also seen higher like voting rates in our survey. People are saying that they will vote at much higher rates than is typical for a presidential election. But also I think something to consider there is there's sort of that social desirability bias on surveys to say that you will vote because people know that that's something that is viewed positively. So I don't think we can 100% say that the rates will be like higher in November, but that is definitely like what the initial results are showing. I don't know if you have anything to add, Arisa or Mason.
Well, I'll persist. I'm looking for questions from, I haven't seen any. How unique is COVID-19 to this election? That is, if in fact you see people moving around in their choices of where and when and how to vote, we all hope that COVID-19 will pass. It may not pass right away, the vaccine, therapies, but by the time you're my age, we hope this won't be a persistent problem. My question then is, could this be a sort of altering event? Do you have sense that when people try something new, vote by mail, do early voting, pick a new location, start at a different day of the week or different week or time of day, that this will persist going forward into the next set of elections with, or more likely, we hope, without COVID?
I think almost certainly voters who get the opportunity to vote conveniently, perhaps by never leaving their car and coming up and voting, or getting to vote at 2 a.m. in the morning, perhaps they might really enjoy that. And so once voters like something, it will be really difficult, I think, politically to take it away from them. And so understanding that many of the new methods they get to take advantage of, as long as their experience is positive, which hopefully will happen this November, then they may intend to stay with that method because it's much more convenient for them than in the future. You're muted, Dr. Stein. You're still muted, Dr. Stein. One of these days you'll listen to me.
I'm unmuted. Can you see the anonymous attendee asked, I'm concerned that as I have received my mail ballot, that I'll be unable to successfully vote in person. Do you want to explain? I know Mason is a poll judge for the Rice campus.
Yeah, so if you bring your mail-in ballot, completed or uncompleted, to the polling location and you give it to a poll worker, then you will be able to vote early in person successfully with no problems. That is well within the law. So.
Phil Cordham has a question again. How much do you think the constantly changing rules, and particularly the confusing decisions of the courts, have affected and confused voters?
I'd say I would hypothesize that it's confusing voters a lot. And I would say, like, just among conversations I've had with voters, like, I've definitely seen that people, like peers, are very confused about whether, for example, they are eligible to vote by mail. People don't really get exactly what's happening there because there's like a new news story pretty much every day. And I think also something really interesting we found is that we did panel back some voters for the second survey that we just completed. And what we found is that there was barely any improvement in their knowledge about how to vote by mail too, even after like we had shown them on the survey correct information about how to do so. And I guess in my mind, I see that kind of as an example of how all these constantly changing and shifting policies are kind of messing with people's heads a little bit, and perhaps preventing them from understanding like clear, direct information, just because it is honestly very confusing. Even as someone doing research on this, it's hard to keep up with everything constantly changing. So I would say I think it's playing a big impact. I don't know if Arisa or Mason, you have any thoughts?
I think as well, it's very confusing. But when recently the court decided that we were not allowed to drop off mail-in ballots to the many drop-off locations. And so as a team, we were slightly concerned about that, but we went back to our survey results and found that actually not a lot of voters knew that that was a possibility to begin with. So I agree with Carolyn, and most definitely that it is confusing, but depending on what change is specifically making, there may be like varying effects on what the impact will be on voters.
Well, let me ask yet another one. The three of you have also surveyed poll workers. We know that in the past,
we haven't. No, we haven't.
Well, we know something about what these poll workers want to do or not want to do. And I guess my question is, you want to speculate about the county has to get close to 12,000 people working the polls. Is this going to be a problem, you think? If in fact voters are confused, will poll workers be able to close the gap in terms of being available on election day and most importantly, early voting? You can
I think most certainly yes. So you may have seen a recent Chronicle news story that 29,000 people signed up to be poll workers since August. As Dr. Stein hinted at, we need roughly 12,000 poll workers to run the election, more than double that amount have signed up. So even if many of them end up dropping out or are unavailable during early voting or on election day, that's more than enough to support polling locations. And so those poll workers are all, many of them may be new. They're here to learn the training for the first time, to get it right the first time, and to help voters as best they can. So even on Rice campus, we're running the polling location with all students and entirely new students, and seeing overwhelming enthusiasm on coming out to work during election day and also on early voting, and able to support people as best they can as a poll worker.
So my obvious question is, what does that portend for voters? I know Arisa and Carolyn were worried that voters might be confused, yet at a level of skill, and I think Mason reported that these are not people who've worked the polls necessarily before, but in fact are disproportionately new people, people who may have only worked the polls recently or never worked the polls before. If voters, you have to be a voter to be a poll worker, does this suggest that there may be less enthusiasm and confusion or more for voters?
I think maybe to push back on this notion of like new poll workers are worse than experienced poll workers, particularly this year, being a poll worker is different than it has been in previous years. And so if you're experienced, you have this idea of what it means to be a poll worker. Perhaps you know the steps you need to take in a normal year, but this year, many things may be different. And so going through the training, again, as a poll worker this year, you have no notion of what the past is. There is no way to do something like it once was because you never did it that way. And so there's an advantage of newer poll workers signing up to work the systems. And I think additionally, in previous years, poll workers have tended to be quite older, around Dr. Stein's age. And so what that means is newer poll workers are much more technologically savvy, and because they're much younger. And so we have DREs, which are all electronic machines. All the check-in stuff in Harris County is electronic. And so those newer poll workers may be more capable of helping voters because they get the training for the first time. They get the full comprehensive new way to do things this year. And they're also familiar with the tech and able to learn it quickly on the spot.
Carolyn, Arisa? So let me ask finally, I know we've got about 10 more minutes here. I don't see any of the questions from the audience. What's your expectations for the election? I mean, you probably have a closer hand on at least Harris County. What do you think the turnout's going to look like? Do you think there'll be long lines? Do you think that people will have difficulty getting their mail ballots in? Do you think voters will make mistakes on mail ballots? Do you think this is going to be a good election, just like every other election? Or is there something different going to happen?
Specifically for me, I think with turnout, I'm expecting turnout to be high. As in the presentation we mentioned, they like the SAFE initiative. They think that it will be a safe method for them to vote. And very few of them said that they would not vote. So I'm expecting high turnout. And I think with the SAFE initiative, that should go well in terms of making sure that COVID-19 does not have a major outbreak following the election as well.
You all share that optimism? Then let me flip it. Where do you think the problems are going to occur? What could go wrong? What might go wrong? What do you think will go wrong?
Go for it, Carolyn.
That's a big question. I think there's definitely room for mail-in voting to go poorly, just because it seems like people don't know exactly how to mail-in vote. And I also think if we do see a huge surge in mail-in voting, something that might happen is that election results aren't going to be ready the night of or as fast as people are used to. And I think that could be a big concern for the election, just because that might have implications for how much people trust the results. And it's really important that people do trust the results in order for there to be, safe changes of power. So I think that's something I'm really interested to see. And then, I think Arisa alluded to this earlier, but it'll be really interesting to see whether people follow through on what they're saying they're going to do and if their intentions actually end up being what they do in practice. And I think you can do all the surveys you want, but you never know for sure. So I'm definitely interested to see how the in-person voting goes too.
Anyone else have an answer? I have a question I could ask, but if you wanted to answer that, that's fine. Okay. Well, you all have done phenomenal research, and it's so admirable. What advice can you share, if any, just from the takeaways that you've gathered, the insights that you've gathered? What advice can you offer to us based off of your own perspective and how you view all of this, just as we navigate this whole voting thing?
I would recommend that you don't take any of your previous knowledge for granted on how to vote, and that you really take advantage of the resources out there at the CCL, at the Rice level, at harrisvotes.com. There's lots of information out there, and people understand this election might be scary for you. You might have concern about how to vote appropriately, but lots of people around the county and around the nation really, really, really want you to vote if you're eligible and if you intend to. And so going out and understanding like the new ways you may have to vote, the new precautions that may be taken, and recognizing how those are being put in place to support you, I think is really amazing. And so understanding like how to do that appropriately and how to vote the way you want to vote, and getting that information is my advice.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a website. Are you able to type that in the chat for the group to access? Thank you. Anyone else have any feedback, any advice?
I think in addition to what Mason said, I would also highlight if there's students out there who are on Instagram, the Harris Votes Instagram is a really good resource and has almost more information than the website, honestly. And I guess in terms of like advice for voting, I would definitely echo everything Mason said. I think just like taking the time to look and find out what your options are is important. I personally am like planning to drive-through vote probably because I can't mail-in vote, which would maybe be the most ideal safe option. And so in my mind, I guess that's the next best option for me, like personally as a voter. So I think just taking the time to go and see what's available to you is really important. And also encourage your friends to like also look into their options and try and like promote the narrative that Harris County really is going to make this safe, because I think that's something that's really easy for people to be scared about.
Yeah, and I would echo exactly the same things. there are many different ways to vote this year, and take advantage of that and vote the way you would like to, and help inform the people around you that there are different ways, because not a lot of people know that there's drive-through voting or 24-hour voting. And also making a plan early will also help people explore their options earlier, so that we're not scrambling kind of near the end of the election to get in all the votes.
You know, this has been an outstanding presentation, and I really thank the three of you for your work, and the leadership, Dr. Stein, Dr. Vann, in leading this project. Yeah, now my question just slipped me. Can you imagine? Well, you've done the research again, like I mentioned before. How has this process changed you? Just out of curiosity, what have you learned about yourself, or just your thoughts about this whole election? How has it changed you?
Personally, I was not that knowledgeable about how to vote, voting rights. That was not kind of my like main social issue interest. And being part of this research actually since last January has really given me the knowledge and kind of, I guess, made me excited to inform my friends and my parents and my family. So I guess giving me the knowledge, and also just like making me more aware and more of an active citizen in that regard.
Great.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. I think I did care like a lot about voting rights, and that's kind of something I've focused on, but I really did not know that much about kind of election administration and everything that happens behind the scenes to make voting possible. So I think that's been really interesting to learn about. And then also this is just one of my like first like 2 research experiences. So I think having the opportunity to do work that's really like making an impact in Harris County was just a really cool experience. And I've learned like a lot personally from getting the chance to like go through this process. And I also had wonderful teammates and mentors, which makes everything better. So.
Yeah, I'd echo that last point. I have unfortunately been working with Dr. Stein for longer than I can remember. So, but they've been wonderful mentors, Dr. Stein, Dr. Vann, and the rest of the research team who are hidden behind the scenes here. And then Carolyn and Arisa have been awesome partners. I am sort of the opposite. I've been known a lot about election law and election administration from doing research on that for a while. But this is taking it to another level, being able to interact with the clerk on a very intricate level and understanding what they do on the day-to-day has been really interesting. And then taking that beyond, using my knowledge here and being an election judge has taken it to another level of understanding like how it actually happens. Simple things like, you know, when does the gate open for the polling location is the type of detail we've begun to get into beyond just you know, voting early or voting on election day. So that type of detail is new to me and has been really interesting to learn about.
Very good, thank you. Dr. Stein, do you have any closing words for us, or I could totally
No,
wrap it up?
I know Libby had to go off to class, so she won't be with us for the end here, but I think she shares with me the same observation. This has been as much a rewarding experience for me, and I know Mason thinks I'm old, which I am, but working with the 3 students has just been a pleasure. Arm wrestling with them to even, nobody works harder than these students. I'm sure many others do, but the 3 that we've worked with have been just tireless. And I think the other is that they have provided tremendous value to the county clerk. I know Michael Wynn, who's the election administrator with whom we work closely, will tell you that this data and this information, their careful analysis has just been spectacular. My regret is that 2 of them are graduating this year. Mason's going to suffer with me a few more years. Thank you.
Dr. Smith, did you have any words? Thank you, Dr. Smith.
No, I just wanted to give my thanks and my appreciation for this. This has been really, I feel like I'm a person who knows a lot and follow elections, but I think I've learned a lot here. So thank you again. This has really been a great session, and we're going to make sure that it gets recorded and replayed. So that's all I got to say, but I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Awesome. So we deeply appreciate the hard work you all put into gathering this information. Thank you, to the 3 students, and Dr. Stein, Dr. Vann, for your leadership. We hope you've gained some takeaways to share with your own circles. And if you have any questions about what you heard today, please reach out to the Multicultural Center and we'd be happy to speak with you. Please complete the evaluation that I've dropped in the link for you. It'll take like less than 90 seconds. So you'll see the link there. I will also send an email out with the survey and the recording of this gathering. So please look out for more programs throughout the semester, for the remainder of the semester from the Multicultural Center. So thank you again for joining us today. We're wishing you a wonderful week. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.